I imagine a world where support act doesn't need to exist, that artists and music industry workers are self-reliant and self-sufficient. That's what I aspire to in the future.
Sally Howland, welcome to the Australian Music Vault.
Thank you.
Now, Sally, I want to take you back to when you were a teenager and becoming interested in Australian music. Who were the local Australian bands that you were interested in? Who did you see live at that time?
The first Australian act I saw was AC/DC at the old football stadium, which is pretty powerful at that time. I was probably 17, I think. God knows what the crowd was. It would have been 50,000 or something like that. So that was a complete eye-opener to me. And Angus is seared into my brain playing those guitar licks. It was phenomenal. I went with my then boyfriend and a gaggle of girlfriends. But it was probably more in my early 20s when music became central to my interests and my social life, really. So Sydney during the 80s was really a rich bed of music. So there were bands, In Excess, Midnight Oil, Cold Chisel, Flowers as they were known then, or Icehouse, Divinals, Dragon. Dragon would have had to have been a favourite, I think. And it was during that time that Sydney really, it wasn't quite a renaissance, but there was so much good music being played live. A significant change from the 70s, 80s. I think Melbourne in the 90s then became the music town because a lot of our venues closed down. But it was a really, really rich environment. And I would go and see bands 3, 4, 5 nights a week. Probably explains why my hearing on a particular side, because I was prone to standing in front of a particular speaker stack at the Camaret Hotel, the San Miguel Hotel in Camaret. It was just many, many fond memories. And little did I know at that point that I would end up in the music business. So it was good grounding for me. I was such a terrible student, probably because I was going out to see music a lot. I had a real disconnect between what was being taught at school and what I saw as the practical application. I think education has changed a lot now and it brings the two worlds together. But for me, it didn't make a lot of sense. So I had very few options, I thought, at the time, and my overriding interests were music and sport. And I happened to respond to an ad from APRA. I think it was Christmas holidays, 1978, so I'd just left school. I wanted to be independent, and being independent meant that I had to have money. So I thought, next best option, just go and get a job, happened to be in the music business, and I'm still there. That job, I was called a logger. So the job, this was before, it was pre-computers. So it was in the broadcast department. So part of APRA's role is when we license broadcasters, be they TV or radio, big promoters, etc., anybody who has a licence with APRA. Other than having a licence, they have reporting obligations. So they have to report to us what music they broadcast. So we had this team of loggers that we had certain parts of the alphabet. So my part of the alphabet was L to O. So I would get either a typed sheet or handwritten sheets from Double J at the time, which were really hard to decipher. And I would go through those sheets and pick up any song that started with either L, M, N or O. So if Let It Be came up, that's my song, Let It Be. And our database of titles at the time was on a microfiche. So you'd look up the song, it'd have Let It Be, Lennon and McCartney, and it would have a code. I'd write down the code. I did that for 12 months before I went spare, and then managed to get another job in the organisation. The sort of entry-level jobs that I had were simply that. I didn't have a perspective on the business. It was processing stuff. I got a job they call the documentation manager, and it's essentially looking after all the publishing contracts. So in the business, the publishers in Australia act as what we call sub-publishers in Australia. So they're agents for the international publishers, be they European, English or American. So it was managing the information in those agreements which give rise to our local publishers' interests. So, for example, Sony ATV represented Michael Jackson. So we had to set up things in the system to make sure that all of Michael Jackson's works, the 50% under the publishing agreement, was going to the local Sony ATV publisher. That then gave me a perspective on the international framework, because it wasn't just APRA doing its bit in Australia and New Zealand. I could see that we were part of a global network, because what APRA does as a collecting society in Australia and New Zealand is replicated internationally across 100 or so different territories. And it's by virtue of those networks that in Australia we get to listen to foreign music as well. If APRA didn't have those foreign agreements in place, then broadcasters and TV broadcasters would not be able to play international music. And on the flip side of that, BBC, for example, would not be able to broadcast Australian works. So it's all part of a wider network, and then the royalties flow from that. There are still issues around something that is ever present, is around the accuracy of reporting and making sure that songwriters, composers and publishers get what is rightfully due to theirs. So with systems, you're able to process more information, so therefore it's more accurate. So 20 years ago, for example, with radio, so there's 250 radio broadcasters in Australia, we would have operated our distribution scheme on a sample basis. So we might take 2 weeks from Triple M and 2 weeks from Nova, 2 weeks from Double J or Triple J. Whereas now, with all the commercial radio stations in Australia, we get a dump of their computer system. We get a file, we run it against our works database at APRA, and then they automatically match. So we pay on radio, we pay 100% of what is broadcast. So that means that rights holders are getting paid for everything that they're due. The other issue is there's always an ever-present argument between music users and APRA around what's fair and equitable to pay. So there's always a bit of tension around that. Of course, music users, despite their support of Australian music, will always want to pay less than what we want to pay. They're commercial operations, they need to get the overheads down, so they will want to pay less. We, on the other hand, want to get the best possible price that we can in terms of royalties for our members. So that's a highly negotiated area. The other issue that is ever present, I know the question was around what's changed, but some things that remain constant is the constant battle about asserting rights for composers and songwriters and publishers. You might be familiar with the recent Productivity Commission review of the Copyright Act, and particularly education institutions that use a lot of copyright material want to have open access, and why should they have to pay for it? So there's always an ongoing battle about having to assert the interests of creators. I guess the most obvious thing that has changed in the last 10, 20 years has been driven by technology. How long have we had streaming for? Less than 10 years. How long have we had the internet for? 20 years. So you had the record industry at its height in the 90s with CD sales, and then along came Napster, which is probably the first model of disruption for the business. That turned into downloads, legal downloads, with iTunes leading the charge. And now you have streaming. So those issues have an enormous impact on the livelihoods of songwriters and composers. And just by way of example, with digital downloads, for example, there are two rights embedded in a digital download, both the performing right, so that's the public right that the composers are entitled to, and the mechanical right, and so that is the copying of the data onto a material, physical thing. With streaming, there's only a single right. It's only the public performance right. So all of a sudden, those artists and songwriters aren't getting their mechanical rights anymore. So that's made a massive difference to the business. Whilst on the one hand, it's opened up enormous opportunities and provided access to a lot of people that they can do it themselves to a certain extent. So major labels, in a sense, have lost a little bit of power because of the democratisation, because of the internet. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, I think. Certainly from APRA's perspective, we've done quite a bit of navel gazing in recent times, and we ask ourselves, well, do we want to be more than a collecting society? So collecting societies are, we license music users, collect the licence fee and pay it out as royalties. So that has been our business model for 80 years. There's lots of examples of international collecting societies now doing joint ventures and investing in digital service providers. Whether they're hedging their bets, it remains to be seen. But it is a question that we are always looking to the future. I mean, if we could predict the future, then we probably wouldn't be in this game. But you do have to prepare yourself for where do we want to be. I'm not sure we've quite nailed that answer yet. I have a very keen interest in Indigenous affairs and how that relates to Indigenous artists. And I think it comes from my personal abhorrence of any form of discrimination. I think that's the seed of it. And life for any form of artist is difficult already. There's no regular income. They don't get the benefits of a salary like you and I might share in, no superannuation, no healthcare cover, that sort of thing. And you couple that with the social disadvantage that Aboriginals generally have. So it's much, much more difficult for Aboriginal artists. The first program I was asked to do, I was commissioned by the Australia Council to do a wide-ranging research study into, was really about the infrastructure support for Indigenous artists on a national basis, and it covered off on things like education, public broadcasting, what was happening in the live music space, and grants funding. That was the first research study that the Australia Council had commissioned outside of an academic. So I was pretty lucky to get the gig, and it was fascinating. It was like writing a thesis for me. From there, a number of programs evolved. APRA picked up a couple of programs that focused on songwriting development, the report was called Song Cycles. I then, in more recent years, was commissioned by Arts New South Wales to do a research study into Indigenous artists across New South Wales. It's a bit of a mapping study. Where do they live? What genres are they working in? And what are the barriers to entry? And I've just finished one for Creative Victoria on the same premise, actually. So it's there's a whole wealth of material out there around what are the barriers to entry for Indigenous artists. And I'm hopeful that in the future we will come up with an industry-wide action plan to be able to invest in a number of programs to support those Aboriginal artists. A lot of it is to do with access. So it's knowing how to access expertise across the business. I mean, one of the recent findings with the Victorian study was that less than 20% of Aboriginal music artists are represented by a manager, less than 12% assigned to a record label, and less than 9% have a publisher. So if you group all of those things together, you then come up with an image that says, well, for Aboriginal music artists, they don't have access to professional networks, so decision makers that are helping them in their career trajectory. So in the absence of those experts, what can the industry do to help Aboriginal artists to help themselves, really? And a lot of it is just to do with issues around access to particular experts and connecting them as well. So that's probably the best example I can come up with. There's a whole range of issues that probably talk for a couple of hours on it, actually. APRA has really been my only employer in that sense, so I'm probably not in a position to comment about record companies I did liaise with publishing companies because they're our members, but I certainly had a perception, if you like. So in response to the first question around am I participating in the gender diversity discussion, not actively at the moment. I know that APRA is doing some good things in that space and has set up some targets. I think one of the problems with the discussion is the discussion itself. Everybody talks and talks and talks and talks, and it's a bit like talking about the Aboriginal space as well. Everybody wants to have a discussion about it. Well, anybody who works in the space knows what the problems are, so why don't we come up with an action plan to deal with it? So applaud APRA for doing that because they are coming up with some milestones to aspire to. In my day, when I first started in the late 70s and then got to a position where I was dealing more with the industry, absolutely it was a boys' club. It was so intimidating, frightening in some respects, and there was certainly a lot of sexual harassment that went on. There wasn't the space to be able to respond to it in the way that a modern corporate organisation responds to it now. You just had to grin and bear it and suck it up. And I guess my response to that was I would just try and be like one of the boys. And that strategy worked. I certainly had a lot of support from my male superiors at APRA. And my work plan is, ethos is keep your nose clean, do the work and you'll get recognised, hopefully. But I did have an experience where I'd applied for a more senior role and was explicitly told that I didn't get the job because they were looking for a man. To which I went, well, thanks very much, and scurried away to my desk. Unbeknownst to me, some women who were in managerial roles at the time protested and went to the CEO, and the decision was overturned and I got the job. Yeah. So that was kind of startling. I mean, I'm still startled by the fact that someone had the audacity and perhaps the naivety to say, well, you didn't get the job because we wanted a man in the job. The person who actually told me that is a very dear friend now. I came out to my friends probably in my early 20s and my family when I was 30, I think. But for heterosexual people, you don't have to think like that. You might be judged on other things, but it's so you lead your entire life as presenting yourself as a particular person. And then all of a sudden one day when you have enough guts, and that because that's what it takes to be able to face any form of rejection, and that you're strong enough in yourself to go, okay, I'm going to present to the world who I really am. Straight people don't have to go through that journey. And how I resolved those issues at work, I think it was simply a matter that ultimately it became known. I've formed very close friendships, very fortunately, with a lot of work colleagues. They're life friends now. I still have those friends. So I got a lot of support there, but what I was fearful of was the upper echelons, if you like, and the board members and how that would be accepted or not. But slowly, as word gets out, people do accept you because they know you as Sally Howland, not as Sally Howland as a straight person or Sally Howland as a lesbian. So it doesn't matter in the end. But you can't tell a person who's in the closet and has to go through that process that it doesn't matter, because it does, and you go through it. So it's a maturity thing as well, I think. And I think gay people of today, it's much more accepted. I talk to my nieces and nephews, and it's no big deal. It's just part of life, where it was really considered quite different in those days. So it was a bit of a journey, but one that one has to take. So Support Act started in 1997. It was at the impetus of one of the publisher members on the APRA board, John Brommel, who was, I think, running Warner Brothers at the time. And the need was that there are a lot of artists who are in crisis. They can't support themselves. If they get a health issue, there needs to be a safety net to help these people. So that's really the premise of Support Act. It's at this stage, although we're looking to evolve the organisation to be more than that, it's really to help music industry professionals in crisis. And when I mean crisis, just to put it in a little bit of perspective, so most artists will live hand to mouth. Again, they don't have a salaried position, they don't have superannuation, and they don't have private health insurance. So if a crisis hits, they're in a car accident, they get a bad health diagnosis. So therefore they can't play live. they can't pay for their medical bills, what do? So this is where Support Act steps in. We help put petrol in the tank, pay for utilities and put food on the table. There was a guy, a lot of the cases that come to us are highly confidential for obvious reasons, but in recent years we've asked a number of the people that we help if they wouldn't mind being spokespeople. There's a guy, a saxophone player, Neil Duncan, and his story, and I'm sure he won't mind me telling this story because he's told it himself. So he was gigging, lives in the Blue Mountains in Sydney, was gigging 4 or 5 nights a week, supporting his family, had 3 children, and he had a diagnosis of a very severe sarcoma on his right forearm, the result of which he had to lose his arm in order to save his life. So therefore, he couldn't play anymore. Now, Support Act found out about Neil and we offered our assistance, and we ended up finding a custom saxophone manufacturer, I think in Denmark. We helped pay for a custom-made left-handed saxophone, which he took delivery of a couple of years ago. He's back playing and supporting the family. So in the meantime, we would have helped pay the rent and paid for the utility bills as well. So that's the kind of things that we do. I'm fortunate at the moment that I've been the chair of Support Act for the last 3 years, and I think I've been on the board for close to 15, if not a bit longer. We don't receive any government funding, so we have to fundraise for every dollar we receive. We're very well supported by APRA and the record industry. So the founding members were APRA and AMCOS and ARIA and PPCA, and they are our stalwarts in terms of our annual funding. We've had some very successful fundraising campaigns. We did a crowdfunding campaign a few years ago called Bandwagon, where we raised, I think, over 100K. We have an annual lunch that's just started to hit its straps. It's called Music in the House, where we honour somebody in the industry for their community work. That was we had our most successful year. The thing that is occupying our thinking at the moment is around mental health and the mental health crisis across the music industry. So we are hosting a summit at Big Sound in a couple of weeks. In fact, it's next week. And the intention of that is to bring every sector of the music industry together, because every sector is affected by the mental health issues of our music industry professionals. So we're bringing together venues, festival bookers, publishers, record companies, roadies, APRA, PPCA, managers and artists. We're putting everybody in a room. We're going to go, what do we need to support our music industry professionals? We're hopeful that out of that summit we will get an action plan and be able to develop some services and programs in support. My great interest also is around prevention, because the way that I describe it, and people who've heard me talk about this ad nauseum, is that what Support Act does is we deal with people at the end of the sausage machine. What can we do to intervene earlier to change the paradigm? What are the structural factors? What are the environmental factors that we can change? Exposure to drugs and alcohol, which can exacerbate mental health conditions. What can we do around that? So that's a longer term thinking, but I think our first step is to see how the summit goes, and hopefully we'll have some tangible outcomes from that. So we recently introduced a funeral policy because we used to have this extraordinary situation that we could only help people who were living. And that just wasn't appropriate, as increasingly we were getting demands to help support pay for a funeral. So I think we implemented that either last year or the year before, and we've helped a number of people since that time. Some of the stories are completely heartbreaking, and it's really fantastic that the industry has come to support the charity, and we're going from strength to strength. Director of Membership was probably the best gig I ever had, I think. Not to take away from being the head, so the head was the next level up. But the Director of Membership, so responsibility for APRA's and AMCOS's 95,000 composer members. It covers everything from people applying to membership to overseeing the distribution of $250 million in royalties, making sure people got the right money, ensuring that our distribution schemes had integrity. I also looked after our international department as well, which was responsible for not only international relations and negotiating agreements with our international partners, but also processing international royalties as well. And then there's a creative side to the job as well. So I used to be the executive producer of our suite of awards events, also our professional development program that was instigated at our 75th anniversary. Instead of wanting to sort of slap ourselves on the back and go, aren't we doing a great job, we took the view that how can we invest better in the next generation. So out of that, the Professional Development Awards were generated. We set up the ATSI Music Office, the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Arts Music Office, so we have a specialist resource there that looks after our Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander composers and songwriters. So it's a real, very broad remit, but it was very satisfying, really fantastic role. The thing that occupies me at the moment with my APRA hat on is we've been undergoing a significant business transformation. In other words, we're developing a new computer system. And so I have a role there in liaising with the business and also with our IT people. So it's really around getting the business ready for a new system with all its risks and contingency planning around that. So that's probably the next 12 months for me. I'm very keen that we have a national response for dealing with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander issues to better support our composers and artists working in that space. And that probably requires an alliance of sorts, I think, with industry cohorts. I think that the partnership model is what's required in that space, as opposed to APRA going alone and perhaps with a funding partner. But I think it is a whole of industry response to that. Insofar as Support Act is concerned, my interest lies in developing some tools to better support mental health issues, to increase our funding capacity so we can do more for more people because the need is there. I think there is a need to shift the paradigm in the industry around artists having better financial capacity in whatever framework that might be. I keep going back to the superannuation issue. It's not, I know there's been some work done in some spaces about embedding that in contracts and things at the moment, but I think it's not across the board. And ideally, I imagine a world where Support Act doesn't need to exist, that artists and music industry workers are self-reliant and self-sufficient, that they don't need to come to a charity to be able to pay the rent next week or to be able to turn the lights on at home. That's what I aspire to in the future.